What's up? Welcome back, everybody. Got Kenny back in the garage with me. This time we're getting even more deep into the motor build and a little more serious because we are hoping to drop the crank in this time. Today, this is the cherry for this motor right now. Is once this crank gets in and we size these bearings up, everything else is going to happen so much faster. So, as the title of this video, I'm going to show you guys how I size bearings up. And before this video even begins, I'm going to put this out right now. This is the way I'm sizing them up. I am not a professional engine builder, and Kenny, are you a professional engine builder? Okay. No. We're not professionals, but we know how to do these things. We make it work, and it works for us. So this is just like a disclaimer. This is how I'm going to be doing it. If you don't agree the way I'm doing it, that's fine. Everybody has their own methods. Drop a comment below if you have different ways, but if you are interested in the way we're going to do it and it actually makes sense to you, by all means try it out because it works for us. So with that out of the way, we're going to show you guys how we size up main bearings in this video. Here's everything we have laid out to start. Now, I said in this video we'll be doing our main bearings, so we're not going to be focusing on these rod bearings right now. These are some of the tools that we are going to be using. We're going to be using a micrometer, which is a 2 to 3 inch mic, and a inside bore gauge, and we're going to use a dial bore gauge. We're going to be using this to figure out our clearances, our crank. For the main bearings and rod bearings, we are using ACL, the race series bearings, but these are standard size because this is a brand new crank. And here's your part number for a standard size, and everything's being assembled with red line. Before we get started, we have our block. It's ready to go. We have our mating surfaces clean with no oil debris on them. That's a big thing. You want no oil on the bottom of your bearing. If you have any kind of oil or contamination under here, the bearing has a higher chance of spinning on here, so you don't want that. So make sure you clean each surface with brake clean. There's no oil or anything on here on both sides as well. You want all of this mint and clean. Once you have your block all cleaned up, you're going to take your bearings, and on your bearings you want to just wipe off the back of this bearing again to make sure that there's no oil on here, that you're minimizing the chance of these bearings to spin. So that's all I do, is I'll just go over here and make sure I grab any little bit of oil off of it. And now we're going to line these, what they call tangs, up in our block. So they have these little grooves right here. This groove right here lines up with this tang on our bearing, and all we do is we'll start with that side, line it up in there, and push down. So now our bearing is seated. 2 clean mating surfaces. This bearing shouldn't spin. We're going to roll the rest of them on. On the girdle side, it has the tang, but the tang is actually in the middle of our bearing, which is right here. Same thing. So you're going to start with your tang in the middle, right here, and then you're going to roll it in. And so now the bearing is rolled in on our girdle, and this is ready to meet on top of the block. So all the bearings are in place. We place the girdle on top of it. Right now what Kenny's doing, he's just running the main girdle bolts and the surrounding bolts around that girdle. He's just running them down so that way there's no threads showing. I don't want to say no slack, but that there's no air gap. Just running them down, not all the way, just until they stop. And what we're going to do now is we're going to torque this girdle down. We have our bearings in here, and now we're going to start taking our measurements. But first thing you want to do is just torque down this girdle the way it needs to be. And to get all these specs, I use my manual. This is for the RSX. This works for all the models. Even though this is a K24, the K20 specs are exactly the same. So for the first steps, we need to torque the main bolts down. These are 14 mils. I believe these go to 22 foot-pounds, and then after the 22 foot-pounds you have to do another 56 degrees. So I'm lucky, my torque wrench has a degree setting on it, so we'll be doing that. And then after these you go to the smaller 12 mils all around, torque those to I believe 16, and then we'll start taking our measurements. We're getting to the measuring part. This part is the hardest part of the whole process, I want to say. If you don't know how to use a micrometer, there's tons of videos on how to use it, so definitely just check that out because we're going to be using the micrometer to measure our main bearing journal. And what you do with this, like I said, I don't want to get into how to use a micrometer, but all I'm doing is I'm sizing this up, taking out the air gap, and when I get that measurement, I lock the micrometer And this measurement is going to be my 0 for my oil clearance. Get the air gap. Check that out. Okay, so now we have our measurement. What we're gonna do, what I do is I place this in a vise, so that way they have tools to kind of like hold this so you don't have to hold it and you can get your measurement, but I just put this in a vise, and now we're gonna get our inner measurement right here, or zero out our bore gauge right in here. We have our mic set up in our vise like this. Next, we're gonna use our bore gauge. Now, the whole reason that we are setting this up here, to the best way I can explain it, our bore gauge, we need it to read at 0. The only way we can get this to read 0 when it's inside of our main bearings is by zeroing it out to what the main journal size is. So this is what our main journal size is right here. Now, I'm gonna slip this bore gauge in here with the proper attachments. Again, this is another tool that you can get really in depth on how to explain how to use it. So definitely just look up some videos if you're curious on how to use a bore gauge. And what I do is I set it up in the tool right here as my 0, and I look for my 0. Now this is actually pretty close to where I had it before, but for demonstration we're going to move this number around. Right, so now we have it in here. So what we're looking for when we sweep is to find the lowest point where the needle goes to. So if I'm going, it goes there, it went up to 80, it stopped, and it came back down. So I'm going to sweep the other way. It came back down, we go to 80, a little shyer than 80. This is the whole point. We're finding that point where the needle stops. And that's going to be my 0. So now I can adjust this. I'm going to try to find where I think 0 is. Okay, so I can come a little lower. Here's another smidge right there. Okay, so now this bore gauge is zeroed out to what our main journal size is. Okay. So now this bore gauge is basically zeroed out to our main journal. So when I put this in here, I should only be reading a couple thousandths. Now, regardless of where the needle goes, you don't have to go exactly by what the number is. If it goes behind the 0, I would still consider that positive thousandths, or if it goes over it, we can follow the sweep of it. Now we're going to put this inside our number 1 main bearing, because we only sized up the first main. We're going to look for our clearance, and that's going to be our oil clearance. More important information, what is the oil clearance I'm looking for on my main bearings? Now, Honda spec is between 7/10 thousandths and 1.5 thousandths, so there's a decent gap right there. I am using ACL, the race series bearings, which is going to be giving me just a very, very tiny more amount of oil clearance. My spec is going to be 2 thousandths, between 2 and 2.5 thousandths. Now, I ran this through a professional machinist. Don't want to throw any names out there, but we went back and forth, and he told me as long as you're between 2 and 2.5 thousandths, that's more than enough. The motor will run fine. That's good oil clearance. So I'm going to put the bore gauge now, because it's zeroed out to our main journal. I'm looking for 2 or 2.5 thousandths. Anywhere between there, we're good. We're going to go through the rest of the line. As long as I see all of that, crank's going in. You are getting ready to insert this bore gauge on these ACL bearings. Now, I'm not sure if this is with all regular K-series bearings, but they have this little indent inside the bearing. You don't want this tool, because you have the plunger down here and up here, to fall inside this little indent on the bearing. You want it to stay on the outside. This will give you a false reading, and you can see that you'll definitely get a way bigger clearance. So when you throw this in here, make sure it stays on the outside, not in this little dip. So we are going to start putting this in. Just be very gentle with it. Should lock this up for the 0. We're going to get our first reading. Now you're going to sweep this back and forth, again finding for where the needle stops. Now what I'm seeing here is 2 thousandths. which is exactly the number I'm looking for, because no matter if I go up or down, that needle stops right at that second line. And again, like I said, just because it's behind the 0, I'm still going to call it as a 2. So I have 2 thousandths of oil clearance. That's my spec. Number 1 is good to go. That's the simplest way I can explain on checking your oil clearances on your main bearing. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each main journal on the crank, get our measurement, zero out the bore gauge at every different journal, because the micrometer is going to read different increments. It might be as small as 10 thousandths of a difference. It shouldn't be much. This is a brand new crank, but each one we're going to mic it, put it on the vise, zero the bore gauge out, and check that one, and so on and so forth. So you're constantly re-zeroing this for each one. Like when we were doing our piston rings, each bearing is going to a specific journal, and that has to be its own size. So we're going to run through that, and then we're going to just get ready to drop that crank. No, then we have to put thrust washers in before we put our crank in, and then we could drop our crank. This is basically how we always check our main bearing clearances. We went through each of the main bearings. They are all within 2 thousandths to 2.5. They just, everything was in spec with these standard ACL race series bearings. So definitely, if you're looking to install bearings onto your crank that is not, definitely have a machine shop check it if you don't have micrometers to check your journals. But if it's a new crank or they're all in spec, these standard size bearings, they work great, excuse me. So what we're going to do now is we're going to end this video. This video was just to show you how to size up your main bearings. In another video, we are going to be dropping this crank. I'm going to show you how we drop it, how to properly lube your bearings, and how to install your thrust washers and check for your crank walk, or I think it was like your thrust, your crank thrust. I forget what the exact term is, but we're going to show you how to check it, what your spec should be. That's going to be in another video, and then another video will be sizing up rod bearings. Same process as what we're doing it, but it's a little different. So we will catch you guys in the next video. Stay motivated and keep making those streets louder.